Hey everybody, David Ryshpan with you for another lesson here on YouTube. Today we're going to look at left-hand bass and how I play left-hand bass in rapper Vox Sambou's band. We're going to look at one of his tunes. If you enjoy the content on this channel, please like and subscribe. Click the notification bell to get updates every time I post. Please follow me on other social media at Ryshpan Music. And if you're feeling particularly generous, go on over to Patreon where you can download PDFs and support the channel. Let's get into it. So let's take a look at my bass sound. We're here in Mainstage, and I'm going to bring up my bass patch, which I'm running in Kontakt 5. I have the Scarby bass layered very low in the mix with the sub-engineer bass, which is part of the Kontakt factory library. And that's just really low in the mix to support the low end, the sub of the bass. The bass is mostly for the attack and the string sound. And it's the same way if you were mixing, you would maybe copy the bass part and EQ off all of the top end, filter out all of the top end, and compress that sub signal so you have a consistent bass presence no matter how far up the neck the bass player plays. So that's what that sub patch is doing. You'll see how low in the mix it is. It's like minus 17 dB compared to the bass, which is at 0. And that's my primary bass patch throughout all of this concert. And then both of the Kontakt patches, the bass and the sub-engineer, so you'll see they're both on MIDI channel Omni. They're both getting all of my MIDI messages. So that is going through Guitar Rig Pro, through their bass amp model. I have the ultra low engaged. I have the graphic EQ engaged, but not the bright switch. You'll see I have a little bit of drive. Volume is pretty much all the way open. I'm taking out a tiny little bit of bass, trebles at noon, taking out a little bit of mids, and then I have it going through the cabinet emulation with a little bit of their Room IR, or what Native calls Air at that point. They've just released Guitar Rig 6, and a lot of this looks a little bit different now. And I'm leaning more on the A mic, which I guess is a 421 emulation, and a little bit of the SM57 emulation, or whatever their B mic is. The great thing about Mainstage, especially for running left-hand bass, is this floating split point. So if you've ever programmed keyboards before, you know that you have to set a split point. If your split point changes, you would have to have a separate setup for every time you needed a different split point. What's great about this is that if the majority of the time my bass lines don't go above this D, then that's where I can set my normal split point. But then if I wanted to play a fill, since I'm already in the upper register of my layer anyway, Mainstage knows that I'm more active in this patch. And I'm active in the upper layer of this patch. So I can specify how many semitones I want that split point to float up or down. So for down, if I were on the kora patch and I wanted the kora patch, which is my upper layer, if I wanted that to float down, then I could set how many semitones that would float by. So that's really the most useful thing for setting up a left-hand bass patch in Mainstage. So we're going to look at a tune by Vox Sambou called MaliAyiti. And the reason we're going to look at this tune in particular is because it brings up some interesting questions of how to consolidate parts when you're playing left-hand bass. So I'll play you the original parts as they are when there's a bass player, and then I'll play you how I've adapted those parts for left-hand bass. So the original bass line for the chorus, as it's played by the bassist, is this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And then I'm playing a two-handed kora part, which would be something like this. I'm doubling the line, and then the second half of the bass line I split off into something else. So my two-handed kora part is something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So obviously those parts are both really quite intricate and really quite complicated, and there was no way I was going to be able to play both of those parts simultaneously, especially those 16th, 8th note, 16th rhythm in the bass line. So my first question was, what can be simplified in the left hand, in the bass line? Obviously the descending G minor line is the hook. I can't change that. That has to stay. But then the second half, which is where the kora does something different, where my two hands are doing different things, that's where I had to simplify the left hand. The first thing I decided to cut were the repeated C's and just play a quarter note. So that would sound like this. Now with both hands together, you'll see I'm anticipating that C. It kind of gives the tune the swing that it needs to actually make that last C not a downbeat, but to be the last 16th of beat 3. So now that's shifted over, and I'll play it that way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. What you might be noticing now is that in my right hand, I have dropped out those ghost notes that my left hand would play. So. And I'm just playing basically straight eighth notes. Except that last G is anticipated. It's the last 16th of beat 4. So here's the right hand again. Now I can shift my right hand a little bit to get some of those ghost notes as well. That would look like this. Now the biggest thing I think about left-hand bass and piano in general is we often talk about hand independence, independence of the hands, where the hands are doing completely separate things. And I feel like that's a little bit of a misnomer. I prefer to call it interdependence of the hands, because if you're playing groove-based music, both of your hands are in the same internal subdivisions or are working in conjunction with each other. So in this particular case, I have a 16th note grid going through in my head, and both of my hands are on that grid. In fact, the first half of the phrase is in unison or in octaves. Now it starts to split. The hard part was having to solo over this. Normally I take a solo in the middle of the tune over that bass line. Which is a pretty complicated bass line. So now if I'm trying to improvise in the right hand, I even have to consolidate that bass line further. Again, I can't change the first half. So what I did is that in the solo section, the F chord becomes just a straight 4/4. F, C, and then G on the one to set up the riff coming back again. So that bass line sounds like this. 3, 4, 1. And then to practice that, when you're trying to solo over a left hand ostinato, a consistent left hand, the left hand has to be solid and on autopilot so that your right hand is free to improvise and think of melodies. I can't focus on both hands simultaneously. And the left hand is the thing that doesn't change and doesn't move. So it's really, I want my attention to be on my right hand on the solo, and the left hand just has to operate on its own. One way to start doing that is to just start playing a common subdivision like eighth notes or quarter notes over the left hand phrase. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. As you see at the end, I started getting a little more creative and getting away from the strict 8-note grid. Then you can just start trying to improvise, maybe first with short phrases and then longer phrases as you go. This song is based around the intersection of manding music from Mali and compa music from Haiti. And this was recorded with a kora player in Bamako. And when we adapted it for the live band at the time, we didn't have a kora player, and Vox asked me if I could play kora on keyboards. And I love the work of Toumani Diabate and some of the other great kora players from Mali. And one thing that is very common in the vocabulary of kora playing as a soloist is this kind of sextuplet feel, and also kind of a dotted 16th, 32nd note, or dotted 16th, dotted 8th, 16th kind of thing. And also those ornamentation, those trills, is a very common part of the soloing vocabulary and the melodic vocabulary of that music too. So that was a priority to have in my soloing. So one thing I did is, if you think of sextuplets, it's just triplets to the 8th note. So if we think of 8th note triplets, 1, 2, 3, 4, ta-kita, 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 ta. The sextuplets are 16th note triplets, so each 8th note gets its own set of triplets. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and ta-kita, 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 ta. And obviously you would never solo in constant sextuplets, but it's a good way to understand how it hooks up with an 8th note bass line. You can take a repeated phrase like I was just doing, which is a really common kind of kora-esque phrase, and just loop that over the bass line so that you understand how it sits against your left hand. Again, it's interdependence, not independence. So I hope that helps in your left-hand bass development. Please let me know what else you would like to see if you have any more questions about how to approach left-hand bass. Once again, please click the like and subscribe buttons, click the notification bell, follow me on other social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Mixcloud, Twitch. Everything is at Ryshpan Music. And if you're feeling particularly generous, please go over to Patreon, where you can sign up, get PDFs, exclusive content, all other kinds of goodies. Take care, stay healthy and creative. I'll see you next time. Peace.